Late at night, when all the lights in the stone house had gone out, and only one lamp burned in the study on the second floor, Elias Corsara sat on the very edge of the leather armchair. His black shirt was draped carelessly over the armrest, his back bare under the dim, tired yellow light. 3 old scars ran along his right side, like 3 punctuation marks in a story that no one in Buffalo was allowed to tell. Maren Vogel lowered herself to one knee right on the carpet, rubbed her palms to warm them and placed them on his shoulder. He tensed immediately, the way a man reacts when touched on a wound that isn't on the skin. His hand shot out, fast and gripping, closing around her wrist, the reflex of someone who'd lived too long under someone else's crosshairs. She didn't pull away. She didn't retreat an inch, only leaned forward, close enough to see his jaw clench and to hear his breath catch. "Let go of my wrist, Mr. Corsara." He didn't let go. "Do you have any idea how long it's been since anyone came this close to me?" "Yes," she looked him straight in the eye. "The whole city knows, that's why I'm here. Now let go so I can do my job." His fingers slowly released. They said that Boss Corsara was just a name these days. 4 years of marriage and no children, a wife who died in Italy, and whispers that had become common knowledge, as surely as everyone knows that Lake Erie in January chills you to the bone. They said last autumn's bullets had only finished what fate had decided long before. Maren had taken this job in his house only because no hospital in western New York would take her calls anymore, and her late mother's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves. She thought she'd come only to change dressings, monitor heartbeat, and quietly disappear from this man's life. But weeks later, on the night when a snowstorm knocked out the power throughout the district, she went downstairs looking for a flashlight and found him alone by the fireplace with a glass he hadn't touched. "Sit down," he said, not taking his eyes off the flames. "There's something I've never told a living soul." And what he confessed that night shattered every rumor in Buffalo and changed her forever, making it impossible for her to remain the woman she'd been before. But to understand who the man sitting in that reading room really was, you have to go back to the winter a year earlier, to a dinner in the long dining room of that very stone house, when Maren Vogel hadn't even heard the name Corsara. 7 men sat at a walnut table so long that those at opposite ends had to raise their voices to hear each other. On the table were beef stew, warm bread, 2 open bottles of red wine, and a single candle burning among the bowls and plates, because the chandelier above hadn't worked for 2 days, and no one had bothered to replace the bulb. Outside, wind from Lake Erie beat against the window frames in long, measured waves, like the breath of a sleeping beast. The third man from the left, a thick-necked fellow named P.T. Malley with a thunderous laugh, was telling a story about his uncle and a fishing boat that had sunk not far from Dunkirk. Everyone at the table laughed. One man slapped the wood with his palm, another poured more wine. P.T. was just getting to the best part, when his uncle had to make it to shore in his wedding suit, when Elias Corsara, seated at the head of the table and silent all evening, not raising his eyes from his plate, cut a piece of meat, set down his knife and asked in an ordinary voice, as if checking the departure time of a train. "That warehouse on Ohio Street, who did you sell it to last month, P.T.?" The laughter didn't stop all at once. It died gradually, person by person, like lights on a block going out one after another, until nothing remained but the wind outside and the faint crackle of the candle. P.T. Malley held his smile a moment longer because his face hadn't yet received the signal from the rest of his body. No one looked at him. The man beside him dropped his eyes to his plate. The man across from him reached for the salt, though he didn't need it. "I don't understand what you're talking about," P.T. said. Elias didn't answer. He slowly finished the meat on his plate without hurry, as if dinner were the only thing in this room worthy of his attention. He took a sip of water, laid his knife and fork side by side, perfectly straight. Then he took his napkin, wiped his mouth, folded it in half and placed it beside his plate. Everyone at the table stared at that napkin as if it might explode. "Bring the keys here tomorrow morning." Elias rose and pushed his chair back into place. "Both sets." He said nothing more. He didn't glance at P.T. once during the entire exchange. He walked around the table, briefly placed his hand on the shoulder of the man nearest the door, almost a friendly touch, and left the room. His footsteps faded down the stone corridor, slow, with a slight limp on one side, until they vanished altogether. The 6 men remained at the table, and none of them touched their food again. P.T. Malley laid both palms flat on the tabletop, perhaps to keep them from trembling uncontrollably, and in the yellow candlelight, the man beside him saw with terrible clarity how badly those hands were shaking. About 40 minutes' drive from that stone house on the southern edge of the city stood a private urgent care clinic tucked into an old shopping centre between a laundromat and a fishing supply store that had been closed since autumn. That night, Maren Vogel was on duty alone, with a very young resident physician and an administrator who was a second-year college student. Outside, wet snow was falling, the kind not quite cold enough to be beautiful, just enough to make everything unpleasant. Near the end of her shift, the glass door burst open, and two men carried in a young man in his early 20s. His face was white as chalk, his lips blue, his body limp in the arms of those holding him. No documents, no insurance, no name. The administrator asked the patient's name, and one of the men only said the young man needed immediate help. Maren didn't ask again, because the next 20 seconds left no time for questions of any kind. She wheeled a gurney into the exam room, called out blood pressure readings, got an IV into the crook of his left arm on the first try, and began working. The resident had graduated medical school only 7 months earlier. His hands were shaking, and at one point he froze in the middle of the room, unable to remember what to do next. Maren spoke each step aloud in a steady voice that didn't falter an iota, the way you give directions to a driver who's lost his way. She worked for 40 minutes. Her hands never stopped, and they never moved faster than necessary. Only when the numbers on the monitor finally stabilized did she remove her gloves. By then, the shirt under her medical coat was soaked through along her spine. The next morning she was asked to come up to the 3rd floor. 3 board members, the hospital lawyer, and a cup of coffee no one touched were waiting in the room. They asked what she'd seen. Maren replied that she'd seen a young man brought in critical condition. She explained what she'd done and in what order, gave the admission vitals and the discharge vitals. They asked if she knew who the 2 men were. She said no. They asked if she'd heard what they said in the corridor. She said she'd been in the exam room and the door was closed. They asked the same thing over and over in 3 different ways, each time trying to dig a little deeper to see if she'd add anything. But each time Maren answered exactly what she'd seen. Not a word less, not a word more. The lawyer took notes. At the final question, one of the board members hinted that perhaps Maren should reconsider her statement. She looked him straight in the eye and said she remembered perfectly well. The next day she was handed a termination letter and an envelope with 1 month's severance pay. Under the reason for termination, someone had printed 2 words, structural reorganization. She signed the receipt, returned her badge, folded her white coat and placed it on the secretary's desk, the secretary who was only a second-year college student. Then she walked out to the parking lot. Her car stood in the farthest corner, a grade sedan covered in road salt, with a long crack in the rear windshield that had appeared the previous autumn and been taped over with 2 layers of clear tape now yellowed with age. She got behind the wheel, placed her hands on it, and sat there for a very long time as snow slowly accumulated on the windshield. She didn't cry. In her head she calculated how much she still owed on her mother's medical bills. Then she calculated the balance in her bank account, and then how long the severance would last. She had no idea that at that very moment, in the stone mansion on the north side of the city, her name was already being written into a cloth-bound notebook, with 2 short words beside it in the handwriting of a woman who had trusted no one in 34 years. 3 days later someone knocked on her apartment door. Maren was standing in the kitchen, calculating how long 1 month's severance would last if she ate only once a day. The sound caught her off guard. No one had knocked on her door in a very long time. The woman standing in the hallway looked to be in her early 60s. Short silver hair, a grey wool coat buttoned all the way to her chin, and winter boots with traces of road salt on the toes. She wasn't smiling. She didn't seem to expect an invitation to enter. She simply stood there, clutching a brown envelope in her wool-gloved hands, and looked Maren up and down exactly once, appraisingly, the way you inspect merchandise, not like someone trying to find you a job. "Are you Maren Vogel?" It wasn't a question. "I'm Ruth Pryor. I manage the household at a house on the north side of town." Maren remained standing in the doorway. She said she didn't take work through agencies, and if this had anything to do with the hospital, she'd already signed all the papers they'd given her. Ruth Pryor didn't move. "I didn't ask if you wanted this job," she said. "I asked how many days you have before they repossess your car." Maren had no answer. The number hadn't left her head for the last 3 days, and she hadn't spoken it aloud to anyone. Ruth Pryor raised the envelope. "Read what's inside. If you decide it's not for you, burn it. I won't come a second time." Inside the envelope was a printed sheet of paper with no header, no company name, no address. In the center of the page was a monthly salary, and Maran had to read it twice because it was 3 times more than she'd ever earned in her life. Below were 3 short lines: on-site lodging, full board, employment may be terminated at any time without explanation. Who's the patient? You'll find out when you arrive. You're not going to tell me who I'll be caring for? No. Ruth Pryor pulled her gloves tighter. And you didn't ask the name of that young man that night either. Maran froze in the doorway with the paper in her hands. A chill ran down her spine, not from the draft in the hallway, but from the realization that this woman knew what had happened that night, and had known it even before she'd come up to this floor. How long do I have to decide? I'll pick you up at dawn tomorrow. Ruth Pryor took half a step back but stopped. One more thing, don't thank me in advance. She said it calmly, as if reporting that rain was coming, and then walked down the stairs without looking back. The next morning, the 2 women drove north along the road that ran beside the lake. The sky hung low and grey, and the water near the shore was beginning to form a murky white crust of ice. The wind blew snow across the road in thin streaks like smoke. Ruth Pryor drove without the radio on, and during the entire 40-minute trip, she spoke only 3 sentences, all of them about the weather. The house appeared around the bend, standing on a high hill overlooking the water. A 3-story building of grey stone with a steep snow-covered roof. Half the windows were tightly shuttered from the inside with wooden panels. On either side stood 2 wings that had clearly been unused for a long time. The snow before their doors lay smooth and untouched without a single footprint. On every corner of the roof was a small black camera. None of them blinked, and each was aimed downward. In the courtyard stood 3 cars of the same culk, and one of them was running, though no one was inside. Ruth Pryor led her through the side entrance, down a cold stone corridor, and up a service staircase with wooden railings polished to a shine by countless hands over the years. As she walked, she spoke in a steady voice, unhurried like an announcer at a station. You must not write anything about his condition on paper. No notebooks, no medical charts, no scraps of paper. Everything you need to know, keep in your head. You are never to go down to the basement even if you need to retrieve something. And do not speak until you are spoken to, not because he's a difficult person, but because in this house, those who speak less live longer. Maran set her bag beside the bed in the small room at the end of the corridor on the 2nd floor. 4 nurses have left in the past year and a half, said Ruth Pryor. Maran turned around. What did he do to them? The woman stood in the doorway and was silent so long that Maran thought she wouldn't answer. No, she finally said. The city did that. Those are different things, and you'd better learn to see the difference soon. The very first morning, Ruth Pryor took her to a small room next to the reading room on the 2nd floor and opened a built-in wooden cabinet. Maran stood and looked inside for nearly a minute, unable to speak. It wasn't a home medicine cabinet, it was the stockroom of a miniature surgical unit. Everything was arranged in neat rows and carefully labelled. Supplies of IV antibiotics of the kind used when ordinary ones no longer work, along with drainage sets, sterile gauze, IV tubing, and 3 vials of drugs that she knew could only be obtained from a licensed hospital. On the top shelf lay a stack of papers stapled together, not an official medical history, just handwritten notes by someone trying to piece things together from memory. Maran read everything in 15 minutes, and by the time she set the papers down, she understood why she was being paid 3 times as much. The 3rd bullet, entering from the upper right side of the back, had left a fistula that wouldn't heal. It had been treated once somewhere outside the hospital, by someone skilled but lacking everything needed, and since then the wound would close and open again depending on the season. Twice in the last 14 months, this man had spiked such a high fever that someone had to sit at his bedside all night, and both times it had been what people in her profession called by a very short and very frightening word. At noon, she carried a tray of instruments into the reading room. He was sitting at the desk with a stack of papers and didn't even look up. Maran stood for a moment, then spoke the first words to the master of the house since her arrival. You're dying slowly from something that would be taken care of in 3 days at any ordinary hospital. He turned a page. I know. You don't know. If you knew, you'd have gone to get treatment long ago. You think I haven't thought about it. Only then did he look up. He looked tired, but not from lack of sleep. Tell me, Miss Fudged, I spend 3 days in a room with a number on the door, a name tag on the bed, 3 nursing shifts and 20 people walking past every day. How many people in this city do you think would know exactly where I was during those 3 days? Mehran didn't answer. I could go there, he said, turning back to his papers, but I wouldn't come out. That day she worked in silence, changing the drainage, taking measurements, keeping every detail in her head because she wasn't allowed to write anything down. All day she thought about how he'd said those last words, without bitterness, without complaint, calmly, like a man reading tomorrow's weather forecast. That evening she went down to the kitchen to eat with the household staff at the long table. 8 people sat there. There was cornbread, a pot of potato soup. In the corner, a radio played softly, and there was a warm, Kaza kitchen atmosphere at the end of the day. Bridget Kunz, a young woman who attended to guests, leaned her phone against a glass in the middle of the table and told everyone to watch. The video was going around the whole city. It was a short clip with music and subtitles, in which someone's old remark from a local radio show had been turned into a joke about the man upstairs. On the 9th second came the punchline. The whole table burst into laughter. Someone choked on their soup. Bridget played the video again, and this time she mouthed the words along with it. Mehran set her glass down on the table with more force than she'd intended. He paid for every cent of your mother's radiation treatment. The laughter didn't stop immediately. It died in pieces, one person at a time, until only Bridget Kunz remained with her phone in her hand, Kulka slowly flooding her face from her neck upward. What does that have to do with anything? You told me yourself. On my second day here at this very table, you said that his family paid for everything and never sent you a bill. Mehran heard her own voice, level and cold, colder than ever before. So he paid for your mother's treatment and didn't ask for a penny back. And you sit here repeating jokes about what he can or can't do in his own room, just to entertain people who would have let your mother die in the charity ward. No one said a word. The radio in the corner kept playing. Eat, said Ruth Pryor from the other end of the table, not looking up. Everyone ate. That night Mehran lay in the small room at the end of the corridor, listening to the wind trying to creep through the gaps around the window, and tried to find a single worthy reason for what she'd done, but nothing came to mind. She barely knew that man. She'd been there only 9 days. She'd just made an enemy of Bridget Kunz for a man who hadn't even known she existed a week ago. It's just pride, she told herself in the dark. You're just defending your own decision. You took this job, and now you can't stand the thought that this place is exactly what everyone says it is. It was a perfectly logical, coherent, complete explanation, and she lay there for a long time, listening to it echo in her thoughts, until she realized that she didn't believe a single word she'd said. The cousin arrived without warning on a Sunday in a gleaming black car with a personal driver, and the whole house knew of his arrival 3 hours in advance, because Ruth Pryor had ordered Bridget to polish the first-floor foyer floor to shine again. Cyrus Corsara stepped out of the car in a soft grey wool coat and a silk scarf loosely draped around his neck, and paused for a moment in the courtyard, looking at the facade of the house with the expression of a man examining a painting he was about to buy. He was 41. He had neatly styled hair and the appearance of a well-groomed man whose face graces magazine covers sold in airports. When introduced, he shook Mehran's hand, and his palm was warm, dry, pleasant, and held her hand half a second longer than propriety required. That delay was so fleeting that if she told anyone, they'd say she'd imagined it. Over afternoon tea, Cyrus Corsara named every member of the household staff without making a single mistake. He asked Bridget about her mother, asked the gardener about his knee, he even remembered the head cook's dog's name, a dog that had died 2 summers ago. And when the cook told him so, Cyrus placed his hand over his heart and said he was deeply sorry, and it seemed he truly meant it from the heart. Then he turned to Mehran. Miss Vogel, I heard you worked in trauma. Yes, I did. Hard work, endless night shifts. He stirred his tea. And you have someone in your family who's ill too, don't you, your mother? Mehran set down her cup. Yes, ovarian cancer. Cyrus Corsara said it softly, almost sympathetically. That kind is usually detected at a late stage. I'm sorry. No one in this house had ever asked Mehran about her mother. She hadn't told Ruth Pryor. She hadn't told Bridget. She hadn't written it on any scrap of paper here because she wasn't allowed to write anything down. Mehran lifted her cup, thanked him for his kind words, took a sip, and let the conversation drift to the weather, because it was the only thing she could do at that moment. That night she was carrying a tray of used instruments down the second-floor corridor. In the middle, the corridor narrowed where the doors of 2 rooms faced each other, forcing anyone passing through to sidle past. That was where Cyrus Corsara stood with a glass of water, as if he'd stopped by chance. Miss Vogel, he didn't move aside. When she turned to go around him, he placed his other hand on her waist, not roughly, not hard. He placed it the way someone might take a glass from a tray passing by a waiter, a gesture completely casual, completely natural, made by a man long accustomed to never having to ask for anything. You're wasting your time here. My house in Amherst also needs an experienced person. I'd pay you no less, and you wouldn't have to carry trays up and down these stairs every day. Marin froze. She thought about the money she still owed. She thought about her younger brother living on the south side of town. She thought about what this man could write in a report that would go to someone, and about who this house would one day belong to. All of it stood with her in that narrow space between two doors. Take your hand off me. He smiled but didn't remove his hand. At the far end of the corridor, a door opened. Elias Corsara walked toward them. He wasn't hurrying. He didn't call anyone by name. He walked the entire corridor with his slight limp, the sound of his steps on the wooden floor as steady as the ticking of a clock. When he reached them, he stopped about 3 paces away and didn't say a word. He just stood there and watched. Cyrus Corsara's hand disappeared so quickly it looked almost comical. Cyrus Corsara began talking very fast, trying to find the stairs. He'd been away from this house so long he'd forgotten the way. He couldn't remember which wing the guest rooms were in. He kept rattling on without stopping for about 15 seconds. The stairs are behind you, said Elias. Cyrus Corsara left. The sound of his footsteps faded on the last step and vanished, leaving only the tray of instruments, the wall lamp, and 2 people standing 3 paces apart. Only when it was all over did her hands begin to tremble, and Marin found it absurd, because when steadiness was needed, her hands obeyed her, and now that there was nothing left to do, the instruments on the tray continued to clink faintly. She pressed the tray tighter against her hip. Elias Corsara noticed, but said nothing, and Marin was more grateful to him for that than for everything he'd just done in the corridor. He'll leave tomorrow morning, he said. Before breakfast, sir. She cleared her throat. He writes reports for someone. If you throw him out now, he'll write about that too, and he'll write it his way. She lifted the tray a little higher. Don't do anything for my sake. I can stay away from him. There's only 4 days left. And that was what she would think about for weeks afterward. He didn't tell her she was being foolish. He didn't say, "Let me handle this," the phrase that in her experience men usually uttered just before doing exactly what they'd already decided to do. He stood there 3 paces away, his hands at his sides, and spoke in that rough voice he rarely used. This happened to you, not to me. Marin looked at him. I'm serious, he said. You tell me what you want me to do and I'll do exactly that and nothing more. If you want him gone tonight, he'll be gone. Let anyone write whatever they like. If you want to leave things as they are, I won't interfere, and as long as he's under this roof, you won't walk down any corridor alone. Either option is equally simple for me. I'm just not going to choose for you. Silence fell in the corridor. Somewhere below, a pot clanged against the edge of the sink. 27 years. No one had ever asked her such a question. Her father hadn't asked. The people who came to collect her younger brother's debts certainly hadn't asked. The hospital hadn't asked either. They'd simply handed her a document, already printed and ready for signature. The world first lays its hands on people, and then presents them with what has already been decided. Tonight, said Marin. Cyrus Corsara left the house less than an hour later, and no one in the kitchen knew why. 4 days later, Marin was passing the reading room with a stack of clean towels when she saw the door open a hand's breadth. She hadn't intended to stop. She stopped because she heard some stranger talking about the South Harbour, a strip of land on the waterfront, and a factory owner by the name of Halbert who controlled 2 lots right in the middle and refused to sell them to anyone. He's very stubborn, sir, says it was his father's factory. He has a family, said another voice, a woman's, possibly an accountant, a wife and 3 children. The oldest is studying in Syracuse. Then came Elias' voice, low and calm, with no trace of haste or excess emotion. I know, I gave him 3 chances, 3 offers, 3 prices, each higher than the last. No one will say I didn't leave him a choice. A rustle of papers being rearranged. Then we proceed, sir. Marin didn't hear the answer. Someone was coming up the stairs behind her and she had to move on. 9 days later, in the local newspaper on the business page, a short notice appeared. Mr. Halbert had sold his share in the family workshop to a group of unnamed investors, after which he and his family moved to Florida. From the moment the workers were told the news until the moving truck left, Only 4 days passed. No one was hurt. There was no police, no lawsuits, and not a single line about anything unusual happening. It all came down to this. A 60-year-old man who'd held onto his father's factory, his whole life lost it forever in 4 days. Maren read the notice at the kitchen table, folded the newspaper, and, as she did every day, carried the tray of medications upstairs. He was standing with his back to the door, looking out the window at the white expanse of the lake, and spoke without turning around. "You heard?" "Yes." "How long did you stand outside the door that day?" "Maybe half a minute." He nodded, still looking out the window. "Do you want me to lie to you?" Maren set the tray on the table. She remembered the 3 children, the one studying in Syracuse. She remembered the trembling hands at the dinner table that evening, hands she'd never seen before. She remembered the man standing 3 paces from her in the corridor, asking what she wanted. "No," she said. "Good." He turned around and began unbuttoning his cuffs so she could start work. "I wasn't going to." It happened at the end of the month, late at night when the whole house was asleep. Maren woke to the sharp screech of brakes on gravel outside. She sat up in the dark and listened. Car doors slammed 3 times in succession, then the tramp of several pairs of feet in the stone corridor below. Someone spoke a short phrase in a voice that noticeably trembled. She threw her coat over her nightgown, shoved her feet into her shoes, and made it to the kitchen before any of them could come up for her. In the kitchen were 4 men, 3 standing, and the 4th sitting on a wooden chair by the sink. The one sitting was Rourke Fallen, a man in his 50s with the shoulders of someone who'd worked outdoors his whole life. His right arm was wrapped in 3 layers of kitchen towels already soaked through with blood, and someone was holding it elevated. His face was whiter than chalk, and he was trying to smile at the man beside him with the sort of smile people use to convince themselves that things still aren't that serious. "To the hospital," said Maren. "Can't," said the one closest to the door. "Then call an ambulance, Miss Vogel." Ruth Pryor appeared in the doorway before Maren even noticed her. Her hair was hastily pinned, and she'd thrown a sweater on over her clothes. "An ambulance means police. Police means 3 of the men in this room won't be coming home tomorrow. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Maren scanned the kitchen. The yellow lamplight seemed dim. The long dining table stood against the wall. On it still lay an untouched tray of bread. There was a large sink, hot water and soap. It took her 3 seconds. "Clear the table," she said. "Move it to the middle of the room. The overhead light isn't enough. I need a handheld flashlight aimed exactly where I tell you. Someone go to the room next to the reading room on the 2nd floor and bring everything from the 2nd and 3rd shelves, boxes, trays, everything. Don't pick and choose, take it all. Put water on to boil. And you too, you're in my way. Move to the other side of the kitchen." The men were almost twice her size. They moved. She washed her hands in hot water until they were red, pulled on gloves and began. When she asked for something, her voice was steady and firm, and everyone in the kitchen obeyed without asking a single question. Elias Corsara came down just as she finished clearing the tabletop. He didn't ask what happened, didn't ask who did it. He took the flashlight from the man holding it, walked around the table, stood exactly where Maren indicated and aimed the beam downward. Then he froze and stood like that for 40 minutes. He didn't say a single word during all that time. Every time she tilted her head, the beam moved with her before she could open her mouth. The light didn't waver once, not even when Rourke Fallen clenched his teeth and the kitchen grew so quiet that the boiling water in the pot could be heard. Maren worked, her hands steady, her fingers moving exactly where they needed to, and nothing else existed in her mind but what lay beneath them. At one point she had to stop, change direction and start a step over, and no one in the room even breathed. Then the step worked, and the next, and finally she slumped against the table, pulled off her gloves and felt her clothes on her back soaked through with sweat, exactly as in her last shift in the emergency room. Ruth Pryor poured her a glass of water, and Maren drained it in one gulp. Rourke Fallen fell asleep on the table, his arm bandaged and his chest covered with a blanket. The other 3 men stood in the corner of the kitchen and seemed not to know what to do with their hands. Elias Corsara switched off the flashlight and set it on the counter. Maren looked at him and said the only words she spoke to him all that night. "Next time, take him to the hospital. I saved the arm, but I can't save a whole man." Saturday morning of that same week, Maren stepped into the inner courtyard to drive to her volunteer shift at the clinic in Black Rock, but halfway to the parking lot, she stopped. The rear windshield of her silver sedan was no longer covered with 2 layers of yellowed tape. In its place was new, clean, perfectly clear glass through which the entire yard was visible. She walked around the car as if studying an unknown animal. All 4 tires were new, genuine winter tires with deep tread, still showing the tiny rubber nubs left from the factory. The washer fluid reservoir was filled to the brim. Both wipers had been replaced. There was no bill, no note under the wipers. She opened the door, and on the driver's seat lay half a plain white sheet of paper, torn from some notebook. Inside was only one line, written in ink in a firm, slanting hand, the handwriting of a man accustomed to writing short phrases that no one dares to misinterpret. The road along the lake stays frozen until April. Marin got behind the wheel. She placed both hands on it and sat for a long time in the freezing car, her breath turning to pale mist on the new glass. She'd mentioned that road only once on her first day, when Ruth Pryor was driving her to the house, and she'd spoken to the person sitting beside her, no one else. She thought no one had been listening. She'd driven that road for 4 winters with a broken rear windshield. And every time at that curve, she'd slow down and grip the wheel tighter, never complaining to anyone, because such things aren't meant to be told. She didn't start the engine. She sat there until her hands ached from the cold, then folded the note in 4 and hid it in her coat's inner pocket. That same day, when she returned, Ruth Pryor was sitting at the kitchen table with her cloth-bound ledger, penciling the week's expenses. Marin poured herself tea and sat at the opposite end of the table. "He doesn't wear rings," she said into the air. "No watch, no chain, not even a bracelet. I've worked with a lot of wealthy people, but I've never met anyone like him." Ruth Pryor didn't look up from her book. She waited until she'd finished the column of figures, drew a line under it, and only then answered. When he was 9, his father gave him a watch, gold with a black dial on a leather strap. He fastened it on the boy's wrist right at this table and said, "This is proof that you belong to the Corsara family." She touched the tip of her pencil to her tongue. He wore that watch for 8 years, never took it off, even when he went swimming. And then, when he was 17, he pawned it on Niagara Avenue. Marin set down her cup. A man died because of an order his father had given a week earlier. That man left behind a wife and children. He took a bus to their house, knocked on the door, gave the woman all the money he'd got for the watch, and left without even giving his name. Ruth continued, filling the next column. From that day on, he never wore anything on his body, nothing at all. His father bought him 2 more watches, but he'd just take them, put them in a drawer, and they're still there. Ruth Pryor drew a line under the last column and closed the ledger. "You asked and I answered, but don't ask him yourself." The next morning, Bridget Kearns went up to the reading room to light the fireplace as she did every morning, but found the hearth cold, the ashes cold, and the room empty and chilled. She stood in the doorway with an armload of wood for a long time, because in her 4 years of working here, it had never happened. By mid-morning, the whole kitchen knew. Ruth Pryor heard the news, set down her cup, went up to the 2nd floor not by the service stairs but by the main staircase, and returned about 5 minutes later. She said nothing, poured herself tea, drank half, set the cup down, and only then looked at the 7 people sitting at the kitchen table. "Bridget, from today the reading room is yours," she said. "And every one of you, wherever you are in this kitchen, at the market, in church, or in your own home, will not say a word about what you have or haven't heard in this house. From today until the end of your days." Someone opened their mouth to answer, but Ruth Pryor didn't allow it. "I've worked for this man since he was 9 years old, 34 years. For the last 4 years, I've watched him walk through this house like a man who was buried long ago, but someone forgot to let anyone know. This morning I came down to the kitchen and saw him standing at the coffee maker, pouring coffee for himself." She raised her own cup. "And then he asked me what bread we had today. After that, no one said a word. So the one who talks," Ruth Pryor added, "will answer to me." In early March, on one of the rare clear days, Elias took Marin to a rocky outcrop above the house with a view of the water. Below them lay Lake Erie, white, full of cracks, with ice piled up at the shore. Further out, where the water still moved, the lake seemed black and steaming under the cold sun. The wind up there was so strong they had to shout. He didn't kneel. He just stood before her, hands in his pockets, and spoke the words as calmly as everything else, then waited. Marin looked at the lake for a long time. "No," she answered. He accepted the refusal more calmly than she'd expected. He just stood still and looked down into the valley for almost a minute. "Tell me why," he asked. "Just don't give me polite reasons, tell me what it really is." "Down there live several 100,000 people who have never met me." She brushed the hair from her face. The day you put a ring on your nurse's finger, the whole city will have the story ready before lunch. Boss Corsara was broken 4 years ago, and then some woman up to her ears in debt slipped through this door and found a way to heal him. And what does she get in return? A house, a name, and everything you see here. I don't care what people say. I know you haven't cared for 4 years. She turned to him. And look what it's cost you. 4 nurses in a year and a half. Your cousin put his hands on you in your own corridor in the middle of the night under your own roof, because once the whole city decides a man is broken, people start believing they have the right to take whatever they want from his house. I'm not stepping into that while it still stands untouched. Maybe it'll stand forever, maybe it won't. He was silent for a long time. The wind swept over the rocks, carrying the smell of ice and damp earth hidden beneath snow, and far below over the white expanse of the lake a bird flew, the only black dot against all that emptiness. You scare me a little, he said. Good, replied Marin. It all started with such a small thing that Marin hadn't thought about it for 4 months. Every Saturday morning on her way to the free clinic in Black Rock, she walked past a row of old shops on Grant Avenue, and in the middle of that row stood a storefront with a glass facade and a faded sign of an old tailor shop. She'd passed it 17 times. 17 times the door was locked, the lights off, and there wasn't a single footprint in the snow before the steps. The shop wasn't abandoned, the glass remained clean and someone emptied the mailbox. It just never opened. She thought about it on the way home then while washing her hands, and that evening she asked permission to look through the family archives. Elias shrugged and said she'd be bored within a week. She wasn't. 3 nights later she found what she was looking for. The shop was under a long-term lease to one of the family companies. Rent was paid monthly into the landlord's account, and the landlord named in the contract was Camilla Ferranti, the elder sister of the deceased wife. The initial rent was $4,000 a month for a place no one ever entered. Then it rose to $9,000, then $15,000. Marin took a blank sheet of paper, divided it into 2 columns, and began comparing facts. In the left column were the 3 rent increases. In the right column, the events Ruth Pryor remembered, since she kept visitor logs and phone records for the house for 34 years. She remembered the very week the calls began, the week when the second nurse's mother called, and the week when the old story was dragged into the light and loudly discussed throughout the city. The first increase came 5 days after the first wave of rumors, the second 9 days later, the third another 6 days after that. She brought the paper to the reading room, laid it before him and stood there with the feeling of someone who'd just caught a thief in their own home. Elias Corsara looked at the page for a very long time. He didn't look surprised, he wasn't much good at pretending. He read both columns from top to bottom, then read them again, and finally put his finger on the middle of the sheet. Half of that money is mine. Marin didn't understand. Get your coat, he said. Tomorrow morning I'm taking you somewhere. They drove east for just over an hour, left Buffalo, and along the road that ran beside the lake reached Rochester. He was silent the whole way, and she didn't ask. Finally, he turned into a quiet neighborhood of 2-story wooden houses in pastel colors and parked at the end of the street, about 30 yards from a little house with a white fence, then killed the engine. Sunlight flooded the front yard. Most of the snow had melted, leaving only a few strips along the bottom of the fence, and the wet grass glittered in the sun. A girl of about 4 in a red coat, holding a cookie, stood in the middle of the yard trying to teach the neighbor's dog to sit. The dog wouldn't sit, it spun in place, jumped, ran around the girl, and then came back, and she kept repeating the same word with the seriousness of someone carrying out a very important task. Every time the dog disobeyed, the girl laughed so hard she had to double over. Her laughter could be heard even in the parked car. On the porch sat a young woman with a cup of coffee, watching the yard and laughing too. Sylvia was pregnant when she left for Italy, said Elias, staring straight ahead. No one knew. She died in an accident, not from the pregnancy, and the child survived. Marin couldn't speak. She's not mine, he added. You already figured that out, but she's not Cyrus's child either, in case you were thinking that. Her father is a music teacher. He teaches piano to children at a private school, a decent, perfectly ordinary man, and he has no idea he has a daughter. Sylvia never told him, she never told anyone. He tapped his fingers lightly on the steering wheel. Camilla knew. She disappeared for exactly 9 months. When she came back, the whole city believed the child was hers. She needed money to raise the girl, and she needed money to keep people from asking questions. Cyrus learned the truth and used it, as you guessed, except that half the money in your left column came from me. I paid from the first day. I paid through Camilla because if I sent money directly, people would ask why. In the yard, the dog finally sat. The girl shouted with joy and hugged it around the neck, and the woman on the steps clapped her hands. 4 years, Marin said very quietly. You support the child of the woman who destroyed your life. The girl isn't to blame, he answered. She just lives. Then he started the engine. She's doing well, someone's raising her properly. She has a yard and the neighbor's dog listens to no one. My duty is to make sure it stays that way and that she never learns a single word of any of this. He turned the car around at the end of the street and they drove back. The whole way to Buffalo, Marin silently stared out the window, thinking about the sheet of paper with 2 columns folded in her coat pocket. And for the first time since she'd entered that stone house, she realized she'd been wrong about the man sitting beside her, and wrong not a little but very, very wrong. At the end of that same month, Ruth Pryor asked if she'd take on another assignment. 2 visits a week in Amherst. She named the patient before Marin could ask. Salvatore Ferrante, Sylvia's father, 78 years old, end-stage heart failure, confined to the first floor of a red brick house with a wide porch and an old maple in the yard. 4 months, 3 nurses had come and gone, and none had lasted long, because the old man often got confused at night and called out for people long gone. Marin agreed. She didn't tell anyone why. The house was quiet and clean, smelling of medicine mingled with old wood. On the mantelpiece were 7 or 8 framed photographs, and among them a wedding portrait of Sylvia Ferrante, a beautiful young woman in a bouquet of flowers, with a smile of someone who has no doubt of her beauty. The old man's bed had been placed by the window so he could watch the maple. On clear days, he told stories about his father's bakery on Hurtle Street, about learning to be an electrician, about his wife who died 11 years ago, and about how she used to sing in the kitchen. He called Murran Österus gull with chestnut hair. He thanked her every time she took his blood pressure, each time as if she'd done him a great favour. And one afternoon, when the light turned golden and the maple's shadow stretched to the foot of the bed, he looked at her and didn't recognize her. "Is it you?" he asked. Murran sat on the chair by the bed and didn't correct him. "Is it your father?" he said. "I heard everything. I heard it a long time ago, dear. They called me 3 times. He breathed heavily for a while. "I didn't tell anyone, not even your mother. I kept waiting for you to stop yourself." He lifted his hand and groped in the air, searching for hers, and Murran let him take her palm. "You told me you were suffering. I believed you. I believed you because I'm your father. But dear, that family took you in. They treated you kindly and you kept." His fingers tightened on her hand, weak and trembling. "I buggered you. I remember begging you. I sat downstairs in the kitchen and buggered, and you said I was old and didn't understand anything." A car passed outside. Its sound faded into the distance. "You didn't stop," he said. "You didn't stop. And then you left, and now I'm the only one still alive." Murran didn't speak. She sat quietly, letting her hand rest in the old man's palm, listening to the clock on the wall in the next room counting off each second. After a while he exhaled loudly and came back to himself. He looked at her, and this time he recognized her. Nothing about the way he said it suggested he remembered a single word of what he'd just uttered. "Girl with chestnut hair," he said. "Could you get me some water?" She poured water, helped him sit up, and he drank in small sips. When she set the glass down, he grasped her wrist. "You work in that house up there?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "That young man," he said, "calls me every month. 4 years, not a single miss. He pays for this bed, for the medicine, and for you too. I know I'm in my right mind. He never says anything about it, and I don't ask." His hand tightened slightly. "My daughter is gone, miss, I know that for certain. But she was my child, and that's all I have left of her." Murran looked down at the hand gripping her wrist, the large knuckles, the skin thin as paper. "So if you ever hear anything," the old man said, "don't tell the boy, he's too good to me." The following Saturday, Rucker Fullen came to the volunteer clinic in Black Rock. Murran saw him when she came out to call the next patient by number and thought he'd come for her to check his hand, since it was time for a follow-up. But he didn't take a ticket. He sat in the row of chairs along the wall, faded orange plastic seats with both hands on his knees. His wool cap was still on his head, and he sat there for 2 hours. People came and went. An elderly woman who'd come for joint treatment sat next to him and talked with him for 20 minutes. He nodded in the right places but didn't say a word. A boy ran past and dropped a paper airplane. Rucker leaned down, picked it up, and handed it back to the child. When the clinic was almost empty and Murran went to the registration desk to put away papers, He stood, walked over, stopped on the other side of the counter, and didn't look her in the eye. He took something from his coat pocket and placed it on the surface, holding it with his finger for a second before pulling his hand away. It was a small steel key, the kind that fits a padlock, with a scratched yellow plastic fob bearing a number. "Just keep it," he said. Mehran took the key. "What does it open?" Rucker Falun had already turned away. He reached the door, paused for a moment on the welcome mat, then pushed it open and walked out into the grey day. She watched through the glass as he went to the corner and disappeared. It took her 4 days. The number on the yellow fob belonged to a self-storage facility on the south side of town, near the highway, a row of low corrugated metal buildings painted faded green, each with a numbered roll-up door. The attendant, a young man with headphones, didn't even bother to look up. The rent for Unit 72 had been paid in cash for a year in advance, and the name on the papers wasn't anyone real. Mehran stood before the door for a long time with the key in her hand, but she didn't open it. She went home, slept on it, and the next morning went looking for Rucker Falun. He lived in a first-floor apartment in Lackawanna behind a tire shop. He opened the door, saw her, and wasn't at all surprised, but he didn't invite her in. He came out onto the porch and closed the door behind him. "Unit 72, said Mehran. "I didn't open it. First you tell me what's inside." Rucker Falun looked out at the parking lot full of puddles. His right hand was still in a brace, and he held it with his other hand, the way people hold something that no longer entirely belongs to them. "Remember that night in the kitchen?" he asked. "Yes, you worked for 40 minutes. You didn't ask me a single question." He kept looking at the parking lot. "You didn't ask how I got hurt. You didn't ask what I did for a living. You didn't ask if I had a wife or kids. You just did what needed to be done and then told them to take me to the hospital next time." He paused. "I worked for that house for 11 years. No one ever treated me like that." Mehran waited. "There are a few boxes in there," he said. "Documents, records, the kind of things people hide to protect themselves. You see, I kept them because I was afraid. I'd had them for 4 years and I never once had the courage to do anything with them." "Who gave them to you?" "No one gave me anything." Only then did he look at her. His eyes were red and tired. "Listen carefully, Miss Fudged. I didn't tell you anything. I didn't give you anything. You found everything yourself. You figured out the storage unit on your own and opened it with a key you happened to come across. If anything happens afterward, I need you to remember those words, exactly as they are." He opened the door and stepped inside. "Mr. Falun." He stopped, half hidden in the darkness of the apartment. "Why did you give them to me?" Rucker Falun was silent for a few seconds. "I haven't slept peacefully in 4 years, he said and closed the door. They entered Unit 72 early in the morning when the storage facility was empty. Inside were only 3 plastic totes stacked one on top of another, a folding chair, and the dry smell of dust in a place no one had visited in a very long time. Elias lowered the roll-up door behind them and turned on the lamp hanging from the ceiling. Mehran opened the first tote. They sat on the concrete floor for half an hour. Inside were bank statements, car rental contracts, payroll records from a trucking company whose name appeared nowhere in the family accounts, and at the bottom of the second tote lay 2 old phones with dead batteries and a digital recorder with a memory card. Rucker Falun had been in charge of the warehouses. He had authority to sign supply documents and issue passes, and for the last 4 years he'd quietly cuppered everything that passed through his hands. Mehran spread the papers on the floor in rows by date, the same way she'd always sorted her mother's hospital bills. When she finished the 3rd row, she sat back, looked at him and understood everything. "He didn't hire anyone to kill you," she said. Elias was silent. "Look here," she pointed to the first document. 3 men were paid, half up front, half after, and the second payment was much smaller than the first. No one pays like that for contract killings. That's how you pay for a job that was executed exactly according to instructions. She moved to the next page. "And this is a schedule. That restaurant closed at 11. You came out almost at midnight onto a parking lot with 6 lights, and not 15 yards from you, 3 armed men were standing. If they'd wanted to kill you, you'd have died that night. It would have been easy as anything." Elias didn't move, his hands resting on his knees. "If you died, that chair would be empty," said Mehran. "And when a chair like that is empty, 4 or 5 families immediately start fighting and Cyrus Kasara can't be sure of victory. He didn't want a war. He wanted the seat returned to him. He wanted 5 old men sitting in a room to just nod, approving it quietly and properly, by your rules. She pushed the paper toward him. He didn't hire people to kill you. He hired them to weaken you, to leave behind a man who limps, a wound that won't heal, and a weeks-long fever the whole city gossips about. And then he let the rumors already circulating about you do the rest. She said the last phrase very quietly. He didn't need you to die. He needed you to become that story. Elias took the paper. He read it for a very long time, much longer than necessary just to read the words. Then he set it aside and reached for a document in the 3rd row, payroll records from the trucking company, and stared without blinking at the name on the 9th line. "What is it?" asked Marin. He didn't answer. He stood up, raised the roll-up door, walked outside and sat on the concrete step before the unit. Morning had fully arrived. Beyond the rows of metal buildings, trucks moved along the highway, their sound steady and distant. Marin followed him and stopped a few paces away. He sat with his elbows on his knees, silent for a very long time. "After that night in the parking lot," he finally said, "we searched for 3 weeks, we found a name." He looked at the concrete at his feet. "I was given proof. Money transferred to an account on the right day. His car parked 2 blocks from there that night. Someone saw him, everything fit." "Did you ask him?" "Yes, he said he didn't do it." Elias' voice was flat. "They all say that." Marin didn't speak. "The name on the 9th line," he said, "belongs to the man who transferred that money to the account. He works for Cyrus's trucking company. The money was sent 4 days before that night in the parking lot." His voice was perfectly ordinary. "He left it there for us to find. He knew we'd be looking. He prepared a culprit for us in advance." A car turned into the storage facility, drove slowly past them, and disappeared into the next row. "Did he have a family?" Marin asked. Elias didn't turn around. "There's a woman in Cheektowaga who now works 2 shifts, he said. "She has 2 children who are still in school." After that, he remained on the steps for a long time, and Marin stood beside him without saying a word, because she understood that no right words existed. Anything she said at that moment would only be a way to make herself feel better. Wesley Vogel came to the gates late one evening in late March, having made his way from the bus stop through a cold rain, and the watchman called the house to say there was a young man outside claiming to be Miss Vogel's younger brother. Marin went down to open the door and found him standing under the lamp on the porch, 24 years old. His hair plastered to his head from the rain, hoodie pulled up, and on his face that same smile he'd worn since the age of 7 every time he broke something in the house. "Don't make a tragedy out of it," he said. She led him into the kitchen and turned on every light. She brought a clean towel, a basin of warm water, and the toolbox she kept on the shelf, then told him to sit on the table and take off his jacket. He couldn't manage with his right hand, so she helped. She washed her hands, put on gloves, and worked in silence for 40 minutes, saying nothing unless it was necessary. She told him to exhale, told him to count backward from 10. The ring and middle fingers on his right hand were dislocated, and she reset them one by one, slowly and steadily, while Wesley sucked air through his clenched teeth but didn't cry out. She cleaned a split lip, taped it, checked his pupils, then examined his ribs, pressing each place in turn and asking where it hurt, remembering every detail because in this house she wasn't allowed to write anything down. Her hands stayed steady from start to finish. When she finished, she made him a cup of warm milk, prepared a bed in the small room at the end of the corridor, and sat beside him until his breathing evened out. Then she stepped into the hallway, leaned back against the wall, and cried silently for about 2 minutes. After that, she wiped her face and went downstairs to get her brother's phone from the pocket of his jacket hanging over the back of a chair. There were several messages. Wesley's debt had been bought out, the whole thing gathered into one package by a third party through a lawyer downtown. The new creditor didn't demand immediate payment. The new creditor didn't pressure him at all. The new creditor needed only one thing, and Wesley had typed it into a message to his sister 3 days ago, not even understanding what he held in his hands. They said all that's needed is a notarized statement about how it all started between you and him. "Marin, I don't see how this could hurt anyone. You'd just be telling the truth." Marin stood in the kitchen for a long time with the phone in her hand, then went upstairs. Elias was in the study. She handed him the phone, he read the message, and she saw his jaw tighten before he read it a second time. Then he set the phone on the desk, stood and walked into the hall, taking his coat from the hook. Marin followed, got ahead of him on the stairs, and stood across the passage with her arms down. Move. What are you going to do? Go to your room. I asked what you're going to do. And he shouted, one sentence very short and very loud, a sound the whole stone house heard. Somewhere below the kitchen door quietly closed. He didn't step toward her, didn't touch her. He stayed where he was 3 paces away with his coat over his arm, the echo of his voice dying in the corridor. Maren didn't step back. Her hands were trembling and she let them tremble while she stayed in place. There, she said, her voice was much quieter than his. That's exactly what they've always said about you. He didn't answer. 4 years this whole city has been making up a story about you, and you let them do it. You endure it all for an old man in Amherst and a little girl in Rochester. She looked him straight in the eye. And tonight you were going to walk out that door and do exactly what they expect of you. Why do you think he had my brother beaten? He had him beaten so you would walk out that door. That was the whole point. Her last words came even quieter. My brother is sleeping in the room at the end of this corridor. I just reset 2 of his fingers. If you leave tonight, tomorrow morning I'll have to explain to him that he was the reason for everything that happens next. Silence filled the corridor. Rain beat against the windows. Elias Corsara stood there for a very long time and Maren didn't take her eyes off him for a second. Then he turned, hung his coat back on the hook and went up the stairs without another word. The last winter storm came off the lake the very night Maren was on duty in Amherst. At dusk the wind shifted direction, snow began falling sideways, and by late evening the local radio announced that the coastal road and 3 interstate highways to the north were closed. Elias drove for her but got stuck there too. He was sitting in the kitchen, drinking coffee with the Ferrante family housekeeper, when Maren's voice came from the living room. She was calling him. And in that voice was something he'd never noticed before. The old man was lying on the floor. He'd tried to get to his chair on his own, fallen, and by the time Maren reached him his chest was no longer rising. She pulled him away from the edge of the table, laid him flat, tilted his head back and began CPR. The housekeeper called an ambulance. They said 30 minutes. In weather like this, in a district like this, 30 minutes meant it would be too late, and everyone in that room knew it. Count for me, said Maren. Elias knelt on the other side of the old man and began counting. He counted aloud, steadily, not too fast, and whenever she began to tire he raised his voice slightly to give her the rhythm. She pressed, she changed hands, she put her full weight into her straightened arms, sweat poured into her eyes, and outside the wind beat heavily against the house walls. After a while she told him to switch and he obeyed. She placed her hands over his to correct his position, and he continued while she checked, and then she took over again. Twice she stopped to listen, and both times she told him to continue. The wall clock in the next room ticked, but no one looked at it. Somewhere after the 20th minute the old man coughed hoarsely, and his chest rose. The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. Salvatore Ferrante lived another 11 days. He was rarely conscious, and when he came to he didn't remember what had happened in the living room and no one told him. All those 11 days, Elias drove to Amherst every day. He came afternoon, sat in the chair by the window and said little. Some days he read sports news aloud to the old man, other days he just sat beside him while he slept. On the 9th day, when Maren was standing at the kitchen sink and Elias was sitting by the bed, the old man opened his eyes and looked at him for a long, long time. He lifted his hand from the blanket, as if feeling the air, and Elias reached out and took it. The old man gripped it tightly. You came home, he said. Elias didn't move. I knew you'd come home, I kept telling your mother. I told her you'd come back, you always come back. The man whose name all of Buffalo feared to speak at dinner tables sat by the bed, holding the old man's hand, and bowed his head slightly. Yes, he answered, I'm home, Dad. The old man died on the morning of the 12th day, just as the sky began to lighten, and the first buds appeared on the maple outside the window. He died in his sleep without pain, one hand resting on top of the blanket. On the mantelpiece in the living room, his daughter's wedding photograph stood exactly where it always had, a beautiful young woman in a bouquet of flowers, with the smile of someone utterly certain of her beauty. And until his last breath, he believed she had been a good daughter. Cyrus Corsara came one afternoon in early April in a black car with a driver, and he brought Camilla Ferranti with him, because she very much wanted to see her younger sister's house again. She stepped out of the car in a black dress she'd kept wearing far longer than mourning required. She looked at the house's facade and brought a handkerchief to her eyes before her feet even touched the gravel. They had tea in the large living room. It was specifically the large living room, because Marin had asked for it, and the doors at the far end were left open, because she'd asked for that too. And in the corner by the bookshelf sat a small man in thick glasses and a sweater with worn elbows, reading a fishing magazine, though no one had introduced him or explained who he was. Cyrus Corsara waited until the second cup of tea was finished before getting down to business, because he'd been raised too well to rush. He said he'd speak plainly since this was a family matter. He said there had been talk that had been going on for years, and that he'd always defended his cousin against it. He said health shouldn't be taken lightly, that the family needed a strong, healthy man at the head, and that perhaps it was time to discuss retirement. Elias set down his cup. Marin rose before he could say anything. She turned on the small projector on the side table, and on the white wall behind Camilla Ferranti, an enlarged image of an expense report from the family accounts appeared, every line clear and distinct. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to ask Miss Ferranti a question about the rental payments." Camilla Ferranti stopped dabbing her eyes. "What are you asking me about?" "Property at 411 Grant Avenue. You are listed as the owner, and a company belonging to this family is listed as the long-term tenant." Marin didn't raise her voice, and she looked only at the wall. "The initial rent was $4,000 a month. That was reasonable. No one in this room questions that." She turned the page. "This is the first increase, $9,000. Mr. Corsara approved it as property manager while his cousin was absent." Another page. "This is the second increase, $15,000, same signature." She shifted her gaze to the right column. "Miss Ruth Pryor has kept visitor logs and phone records for this house for 34 years. The records show the exact weeks when calls began to the mothers of the women who worked here. The first wave of calls came on the 5th day after the first rent increase, the second 9 days after the second, the third 6 days after the last increase." She lowered her hand. "I can't prove why a person does one thing or another. I can only show you the date he did it, and the date it became useful to him, and then let you do the math yourself." "This maid is reading a ledger," said Cyrus Corsara, and there was less warmth in his voice. "This is nothing." "These are dates," said Marin. "Would you like me to read them again more slowly? Because the doctor sitting right behind you has been writing every one of them in his notebook for the last 2 minutes. Cyrus Corsara turned around. The little man in thick glasses touched the tip of his pencil to his tongue. "Warren Holloway," he said cheerfully. "Trauma surgeon, 31 years experience here and in Cleveland. I conducted a full medical examination of Elias Corsara in the spring of the year his wife left for Italy, at his own request. I found a completely healthy man. I told him so. I told the same to his wife's attending physician, and for the last 4 years I've said the same to anyone polite enough to ask." He looked over his glasses. 4 years. Not one person repeating that story thought to ask the only person in this state who could answer that question. "Don't you find that strange?" Camilla Ferranti jumped up, and her chair fell back onto the wooden floor. The handkerchief slipped from her hand. "You told me it was rental money," she said. "Cyrus, you told me it was rental money." Cyrus Corsara didn't look at his sister-in-law standing by the overturned chair. He set down his cup, opened the leather briefcase at his feet, and pulled out a stapled stack of papers he'd brought with him from the start and hadn't used until now. He laid it on the low table in the center of the room and turned it so everyone could see. "Miss Vogel is very good at reading dates," he said. "I can read a few things myself." It was a notarized statement from a man named Dale Brenner, a union representative at the hospital where Marin had once worked night shifts, the very man who'd sat in the conference room on the same side of the table as she had that day. He'd laid out the whole story, the date, the amount, $42,000, in exchange for a signature on a non-disclosure agreement, in exchange for withdrawing a complaint, in exchange for silence about a surgeon who'd gone into the operating room drunk. And the date of the signature, clearly written on the page, fell exactly in the month when her mother had begun her final round of chemotherapy. Elias Corsara hadn't known. Marin saw it on his face before he could hide it. Everyone in the room looked at her. "You stand here lecturing us about truth," said Cyrus Corsara, and the warmth returned to his voice, the calm, reassuring voice of a man helping someone in need. "You've already sold yourself once, Miss Vogel. I'm just offering more than that hospital did." Marin didn't glance at the papers. She didn't look at Elias. She stayed where she was by the projector, her arms at her sides. "Yes," she said, "I signed it." No one said a word. Mother had 4 months left, she said. The doctor told me that number on a Tuesday morning. I sat in my car in the parking lot and counted. 4 months of medication, 4 months of someone coming to her home every day, 4 months in her own house instead of a 12-bed ward. I calculated what it would cost and I didn't have that money. And then they put this paper in front of me. Her voice stayed as even as when she'd read out medical bills. I signed it on Thursday afternoon. I bought my mother those 4 months and she died at home in her own room. And I sat beside her. That surgeon kept his license and I've lived every day since with what I did. She looked at Cyrus Corsara for the first time. But you just did something very foolish, sir. He was silent. You just proved to everyone in this room exactly what I wanted them to see, she said. People sign papers like that when they have nowhere else to go. Only then do they sign them. You took my paper and showed it to everyone, and you didn't understand that you also displayed the reason I signed it. She took the projector remote and turned it off. The wall went blank and white again. And now I have another way out. Cyrus Corsara stood up. He slowly buttoned his jacket, picked up his leather briefcase and walked toward the door. At the threshold he stopped and turned. There was no more warmth in his face. Nothing remained of the man who'd just been drinking tea in a beautiful room. Your brother owes $87,400, he said. I have all the documents. You say one word about what happened today outside this room, and by Christmas he'll be in state prison, and you'll be the one who put him there. Elias Corsara rose from his chair. Sit down, said Marin without turning around. Please. He stood for a second, then sat. Sir, said Marin, my brother is a fool. He's been a fool since he was 19. I've paid for that foolishness my whole life. $87,400. She nodded slowly. I earn $54,000 a year. If I live modestly, I can pay you back in 7 years, and I will live modestly because I've never known any other way of life. She continued in the same tone. You could wipe that debt out today, I know the price. You want me to sign a paper saying I climbed into bed with a broken man and became mistress of this house. She never raised her voice. I'd rather watch my brother go to prison, and if he understood what he was signing, he'd choose the same, but he never understood and he never will. She took the packet from the low table and placed it in his hands. Go home, you won't put him in prison. The day you do, everyone will ask why a man like you would make such a fuss over $87,000, and then someone will look at the dates. The meeting took place 9 days later, on the top floor of an old Italian restaurant on Hurtle Street, in a private room that 5 families had used for over 60 years, a round table, 10 chairs, no phones, no briefcases, and no one brought anything with them. That was the rule, and it had existed since the fathers of those men now sitting there were alive. 4 old men arrived first and took their places. Cyrus Corsara came with 2 men who stood against the wall behind him, arms folded across their chests. Elias Corsara came last alone. He brought no one and brought nothing. He pushed the door open with one hand, entered, and crossed the room with that slight sideways limp, slower than usual because the wooden stairs outside were steep. For 4 years the whole city said he was broken. If he'd walked through that door tonight with a gun under his coat and 4 men behind him, he'd have been exactly what everyone thought he was. He carried nothing and walked to the empty chair on the opposite side of the table. One of the 2 men standing behind Cyrus Corsara was the younger nephew of P.T. Mal, the man whose hands had trembled at the dinner table last winter when Elias had passed by him. The young man straightened, pushed the nearest table aside and stepped back. He did it before he could think. His body moved, not his mind. A second later he realized what he'd done. His face went pale and he retreated to his former place against the wall. No one in the room said a word about it, but Cyrus Corsara saw everything. He saw it very clearly, and for a moment something flickered across his face, then vanished. He spoke for 20 minutes. He spoke very well, clearly and without raising his voice, and reasoned about health, about stability, about the family needing to know who would be in their place 10 years from now. He didn't mention the expense bill, Grant Avenue, or his sister-in-law. The 4 old men listened. When he finished, 3 of them asked a few brief questions, and he answered each clearly. The 4th, the oldest of them, sat in the darkest part of the room and remained silent. His name was Calloway. He was 81 and he hadn't spoken a word since entering the room. Now he laid both hands on the tabletop. 3 years ago, said Mr. Calloway, this young man came to my house. Everyone turned to him. He sat in my kitchen and told me that my nephew wasn't strong enough to hold this position. He said it very skillfully. He said the same thing the whole city was saying at the time, and I heard it so often that I accepted it as truth. He raised his eyes to Elia's. I believed him. I'm the one who told him to proceed. No one moved. So today I cast my vote, said Mr. Calloway, and I cast it against myself. He pushed his chair back and slowly stood, leaning one hand on the table. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Corsara. I'm telling you this only so that from now on you never trust an old man who sits silent in a room. It lay at the very bottom of the third drawer under a layer of old folders, and Marin found it on the last evening when she was sorting through papers in the study. It was a small envelope with a penciled date on the label, and inside were two things. The first was a printout of messages sent and received on an old phone over the last 2 years, names, times, and all the rest. The second was a recording less than 4 minutes long. A woman's voice, talking to her sister in a car, not knowing she was being recorded. In those 4 minutes was everything that the whole city of Buffalo had been telling completely wrong for the last 4 years. Marin listened to it to the end. Then she listened a second time. She sat alone in that room for a long time, and when she finally stood, she understood exactly what she was holding. Give those 4 minutes to 3 people in the city, and by breakfast the next morning the old story would be dead. It wouldn't just fade or gradually lose intensity, it would be dead outright, completely, and people would have to spend the rest of their lives retelling it backward. She carried the envelope downstairs. Elia's was in the inner courtyard by the steel barrel where the gardener burned dry leaves, and a fire was burning inside because late spring nights were still cold. He took the envelope, opened it, and read the pages by firelight. Then he lifted the small memory card and turned it between his fingers. He stood there for a very long time, long enough for the flames in the barrel to die down, then flare up again when a new piece of wood caught. That little girl has a father who's never seen her, he said. He teaches children to play the piano. He's never done anything wrong to me, to her, or to anyone else. He doesn't even know he has a daughter. He was still looking at the memory card. If I release this, the whole city will know within a week. Then he'll know. And 15 years from now, she'll type her mother's name into a computer, because every child eventually does, and she'll read all of it. He turned to Marin. I have no right to do that to a child just because I want people to stop laughing at me. He dropped the memory card into the barrel. Then he sent the pages into the fire one by one, unhurriedly, and the paper curled, caught, and blazed bright gold, lighting their faces. Marin stood beside him and didn't stop him. She said nothing. She stayed there until the last page had turned to ash and only red embers remained in the barrel, while the wind from the lake lifted the ashes in a thin grey trail that dissolved into the darkness over the trees. Several days later, on a May afternoon, Marin came down to the kitchen for water and found Ruth Pryor sitting at the head of the table with her cloth-bound ledger and pencil, calculating the week's expenses exactly as she'd done for 34 years. Beside her sat a cold cup of tea. Marin sat down and, without knowing why, took from her coat pocket the note she'd kept since February, folded in 4, and laid it on the table. Did you know about this? She asked. About the car, the rear windshield, the tires, everything else. Ruth glanced briefly at the note, then finished her column of figures. It wasn't him, she said. It was me. Marin was silent. He gave me some money at the end of January and told me to buy you whatever you needed. That's all. He didn't specify. Ruth drew a line under the column. I went to the parking lot and looked at the car. I called a mechanic from Sheridan Road. I chose the tires myself because you drive that road every Saturday and I've been driving it for 34 years. She turned the page. He doesn't even know what was wrong with your car. He's never once looked at it in his life. Marin stood to pour water but froze at the sink, facing away, opened the tap and closed it without filling a glass. Something inside her went cold so suddenly that she felt ashamed. And as for the note, said Ruth Pryor without looking up, he wrote it. Marin turned around. I brought him all that and asked him to write something so I could leave a note on the driver's seat. I thought it would take him 3 seconds. She entered another line of figures. He sat at this table for 40 minutes. I had to go back twice. The next morning I found several crumpled sheets in the wastebasket. I didn't read them. Beyond the kitchen window, the evening wind rustled in the bushes where the first new leaves were just beginning to appear. Mrs. Pryor, said Marin, why did you come to me that day? Ruth Pryor finished the last column. She wrote the final total in the corner of the page, checked it and set down the pencil. There were 211 applications, she said. They came from 3 different offices over more than a year. I read every one. More than 40 applicants had more experience than you, and over a dozen were significantly cheaper. She closed the ledger. I chose you because out of all those 211 people, you were the only one fired for telling the truth. Marin couldn't speak. In this house, Ruth Pryor continued, people can buy almost anything. They buy doctors, lawyers, people willing to put their signature on property, and even sworn affidavits from union leaders. I didn't just need a good nurse, Miss Vogel. I needed someone who couldn't be bought. She picked up the ledger and the cold cup of tea and stood. That's all, she said, and left the kitchen. No one dared to touch Cyrus Corsara. The world he'd navigated all his life had its own laws. And those laws said that stealing from the family coffers to buy compromising material against the head of the family was something no one forgave. The families voted. He lost everything in one summer. For many years he lived in another city, 100 miles away, selling insurance in an office with 3 desks. And by the time he died in Buffalo, almost no one remembered his name. They married in September. No church, no 600 guests, no photographs in the newspapers. The wedding took place in the common room of the volunteer clinic in Black Rock, a room with vinyl flooring, rows of folding chairs, and a flu vaccine bulletin board. 60 people came. Most were clinic patients. An elderly woman with arthritis in her hands sat in the front row and cried through the entire ceremony. Warren Hullower stood beside the groom in a suit he'd worn for 20 years, cursing the weather from beginning to end. He cursed the September wind in this city, cursed the road he'd had to drive, and even the folding chair he'd had to sit on. Every time he swore, Elias laughed, and Maran suddenly realized that in all the time she'd known him, she'd never heard him laugh so much. That morning before they left, he told her that he would cancel Wussler's entire debt that same day, call it a wedding gift and be done with it. Maran said no. She said that if he paid for Wussler, the boy would grow accustomed to the idea that every time trouble came, someone else would pay for him, and he'd believed that for all of his 24 years. Elias looked at her a moment, nodded, and never brought it up again. Wussler Vudged worked off that debt, 4.5 years working the night shift at the family concrete plant, earning $19 an hour, exactly what everyone else earned, not a cent more. The process of exiting the illegal side of the business took 7 years. Elias did it gradually, step by step, carefully, because haste meant someone would lose their job and someone would lose their life. The South Harbor operations were sold. The trucking company sold. 3 restaurants on Ulmutst Avenue remained, but now they kept completely transparent books. The concrete plant also stayed, preserving all 90 jobs. Over those 7 years, 3 men who'd once called him brother stopped speaking to him. One of them lived in Cleveland, a man who'd stood beside him at his father's funeral. When that man died in winter, Elias didn't go to the funeral, knowing he was no longer welcome there. He read the short notice in the newspaper, folded the paper, and sat on the back porch for a long time that night. Maran brought him a cup of coffee and sat beside him on the step. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He took the coffee and looked down at the dark expanse of the lake. "No," he answered, "but I don't pretend it cost me nothing." Wussler Vudged worked the night shift at the concrete plant for 4.5 years and paid off every last dollar. And for all those 4.5 years, he never asked anyone for anything. In the 3rd year, he became shift foreman. In the 5th year, he married a 2nd-grade teacher from South Buffalo. In his wedding speech, he said that his sister had saved him by refusing to save him. The whole hall laughed, thinking it was a joke. Rucker Fullen left that autumn, and no one tried to stop him. A few years later, the Black Rock Clinic received a postcard from Montana. No message, no signature, only a photograph of a stream and a man's hand holding a fishing rod. The right hand, whole and undamaged. Maran pinned the postcard to the bulletin board next to the vaccine announcements, and it hung there for many years. And the woman in Chucktowaga received a deposit in her bank account every month until her death, never knowing where it came from. She stopped working double shifts. Both her children graduated college, one became an engineer, the other got a job at the city library, and neither of them ever learned anything. The following spring their first child was born, a boy, then another son, and then a daughter who turned out to be more trouble than both brothers combined. Maran kept the family accounts for 30 years and did it better than anyone before her. The Black Rock Clinic was rebuilt with 8 exam rooms and a dental suite, and on the stone at the main entrance a name was carved, not hers because she wouldn't allow it, but her mother's. And Elias kept asking. He asked in the evenings when she sat at the table with her columns of figures, and all those years he never stopped asking the same question. Are you happy? Murron set down her pen. Do you hear the fireplace crackling? He nudged. All 3 children are asleep, this month's bills are paid, and this morning a woman called the clinic asking for a job because someone told her it was a decent place. She picked up her pen again and returned to her column of figures. You ask me that every evening. You can stop when you finally listen to the answer. Perhaps after everything, what remains is not a question of who was right or who was wrong, but how we choose to treat a person after the whole world has already decided who they are. That man held in his hands what could have cleared his name overnight, what he'd searched for 4 years, and he threw it into the fire so that a child who'd never done anything wrong would never read that story. What about you? Would you burn it or would you tell the truth to reclaim your honor? Please share your honest thoughts in the comments. I read every line and it truly matters to me to know what this story stirred in you. And if it mattered to you, please like, share the video and subscribe to our channel so we can keep bringing you new stories every day. I wish you good health, peaceful days, and a joyful life beside the people you love. For now, goodbye and see you in the next video.